Have you ever walked away from a conversation and thought, why was that so exhausting? You said the words, they said the words, nothing terrible happened, and yet somehow the conversation felt like work. Maybe you were searching for the next thing to say. Maybe you kept explaining yourself. Maybe you were asking question after question, trying desperately to keep the conversation alive. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the reason conversations feel difficult isn't because you're bad at communicating. It's because you're trying too hard to communicate. There is one speaking habit that quietly makes conversations harder than they need to be. You keep trying to fill the silence. You hear 2 seconds of quiet and your brain immediately says, say something. So you say something. Then you realize it sounded awkward, so you explain it. Then you worry they misunderstood, so you explain the explanation. And suddenly a simple conversation has turned into a small verbal marathon. But what if silence isn't the enemy? What if the problem isn't that you have nothing interesting to say? What if the problem is that you don't give people enough space to say something interesting back? Think about the last time you were talking to someone you really enjoyed being around. Did they constantly entertain you? Did they have a perfect response to everything? Did they speak without pauses? Probably not. In fact, some of the most comfortable conversations you've ever had probably contain moments of silence, and you didn't panic. Why? Because you felt safe. That's the first thing I want you to understand. Great conversation is not about constantly producing words. It's about creating enough space for connection to happen. I remember noticing this in everyday conversations. Someone would ask me a simple question like, how have you been? And instead of answering naturally, I'd almost feel this invisible pressure to give them a fascinating answer. So rather than saying, I've been good, I've been working on a few things, I'd start adding more. I've been good actually. It's been pretty busy lately. I've been working on this thing, and then there was this other thing, and honestly, it's been kind of crazy. And halfway through, I could feel myself losing the person. Not because what I was saying was terrible, but because I was trying to make an ordinary answer extraordinary. Have you ever done that? Someone asks you a simple question, and suddenly you feel like you're giving a TED talk. You don't need to. One of the biggest upgrades you can make to your communication is learning to stop performing and start participating. There's a difference. When you perform, you're thinking, how am I coming across? When you participate, you're thinking, what is happening between us? That tiny shift changes everything. Because the moment you stop monitoring yourself, you become more available to the other person. You actually listen. You notice their expression. You hear the emotion behind their words. You become curious. And curiosity is one of the most powerful conversation skills you can develop. But here's where it gets interesting. Most people think being a good conversationalist means having great questions. So they learn lists of questions. What do you do? Where are you from? What are your hobbies? What do you like to do for fun? And there's nothing wrong with those questions. The problem comes when you treat conversation like an interview. Question, answer. Question, answer, question. And so at some point, the other person feels like they're being interrogated by a very friendly police officer. The better approach is to listen for what I call the open door. Every time someone speaks, they leave little doors you can walk through. Imagine someone says, I've been really tired lately. Work has been insane. You could say, oh, what do you do? That's fine. But you could also hear the emotional door. You've had a rough week. Now something changes. You're no longer collecting information. You're exploring their experience. Maybe they say, yeah, my manager has been putting a lot of pressure on me. Now there's another door. What's been the hardest part? And suddenly you're having a real conversation. Notice what you didn't do. You didn't try to impress them. You didn't tell a better story. You didn't rush to relate it back to yourself. You simply followed the thread. That is the second habit I want you to develop. Stop thinking about what to say next and start listening for what deserves to be explored. This is harder than it sounds. Because most of us listen with half our attention. The other half is backstage preparing our next line. Someone is talking, and inside your head you're thinking, okay, what should I say? Should I tell that story? Did that sound weird? Am I making enough eye contact? What do I say after this? You're physically there, but mentally you're writing the next paragraph, and that creates a strange experience. You're in the conversation, but you're not really in the conversation. So try something simple. For your next conversation, give yourself one job. Understand the person. Not impress them. Not entertain them. Not prove that you're smart. Understand them. Ask yourself, what are they excited about? What are they worried about? What do they care about? What part of this story has emotion behind it? When you do that, conversations become much easier because you no longer have to manufacture topics. People are already giving you material. You just have to notice it. And this brings us to another habit that makes conversations unnecessarily difficult. You explain too much. You make a statement. Then you immediately feel the need to defend it. You say, I actually really like working alone. Then you add, not that I don't like people. I love people. I just mean sometimes I focus better alone. But obviously I can work with a team too. Why are you doing this? Because somewhere along the way, you learn that being misunderstood is dangerous. So you try to control how everyone interprets you, but you can't. And the more you try, the more nervous your communication sounds. Confident people are often comfortable leaving a sentence alone. They don't immediately chase it. They don't put a safety net around every opinion. They trust the listener to understand. This doesn't mean you should be careless or rude. It means you can say what you mean and allow it to breathe. Try this. The next time you make a statement, don't immediately add another sentence to protect it. Say it. Pause. Let the other person respond. You might be amazed by what happens. They may ask a question. They may disagree. They may share their own experience. And suddenly you have a conversation instead of a monologue. There's another reason this matters. When you constantly feel silence, you accidentally communicate nervousness. Not always, of course, but often. Because silence says, I'm comfortable enough to wait. Rushing says, I need this moment to go well. And people can feel the difference. Think about someone who speaks slowly, pauses before answering, and doesn't seem desperate to prove anything. There's something about them, isn't there? You lean in, you listen, you assume their words matter. That is why your pauses are not empty. They are part of your communication. A pause gives your words weight. It gives the other person time to process. It gives you time to think. And perhaps most importantly, it tells your nervous system, we are not in danger, we don't have to rush. So here's a small challenge. In your next conversation, when you feel the urge to immediately respond, wait 1 extra second. Just one. Take a breath and speak. That tiny pause can completely change the quality of your response. And now let's go one level deeper. There's a habit underneath all of these habits. You are trying to make the conversation go somewhere. You want it to be interesting. You want the other person to like you. You want them to think you're intelligent. You want there to be chemistry. And because you want all of those things, you start steering. But great conversations often become great because nobody is forcing them to become great. Think about sitting with a close friend. You can talk about something serious for 10 minutes. Then somehow you end up talking about a ridiculous video you saw 3 days ago. Then you're laughing. Then you're talking about childhood. Then you're discussing something you've never told anyone before. Where was the plan? There wasn't one. The conversation followed curiosity. That is the fourth lesson. Stop trying to control the outcome of the conversation and start responding to what is actually happening. If the conversation becomes serious, let it become serious. If something funny happens, laugh. If there's a pause, let there be a pause. If someone changes the subject, follow them for a moment. You don't need to drag the conversation towards some imaginary destination. And here's the beautiful part. When you stop trying to control the conversation, you also stop trying to control how people perceive you. That is where confidence begins. Because real confidence is not thinking, everyone will love me. Real confidence is thinking, I'll be okay even if this conversation isn't perfect. That is freedom. You can say something awkward and recover. You can pause. You can admit, I actually don't know. You can laugh at yourself. You can let a conversation end without assuming you failed. And that last one is incredibly important. Sometimes a conversation is simply over. You don't need to resurrect it. You don't need to throw random questions into the air because you're afraid of saying goodbye. You can smile and say, it was really good talking to you. That's it. You're allowed to let moments end. Because the goal of communication is not to eliminate every awkward second. The goal is to become comfortable enough that awkward seconds don't control you. So the next time you find yourself thinking, what do I say now? Stop, take a breath. Listen, look for the open door. Follow the thread. Say less when less is enough. And give the other person room to meet you halfway. Because the best conversationalists aren't necessarily the people with the most words. They're the people who make you feel like your words matter. And maybe that's the biggest shift you can make. You don't have to become funnier. You don't have to memorize clever lines. You don't have to become the most charismatic person in the room. You just have to stop treating every silence like an emergency. Stop trying to prove that you belong in the conversation. You already do. Let your words breathe. Let other people speak. Let yourself listen. And let the conversation become something you build together rather than something you have to carry alone. Because once you stop trying so hard to make every conversation work, something strange happens. Conversations start working, not because you finally found the perfect thing to say, but because you finally realized you never needed to say so much in the first place.